everybody. It's lovely to see you tonight. I hope you are all ready for a brand new book. We're going to move on to one of my more favorite books in the Bible. Not that you should have favorites, we love them all equally. But it is one of my favorite ones to read, the book of Judges. We're going to have a look at it tonight, do a quick overview on the whole book of Judges, and then look at what we have in Judges 1. I don't want to worry you, but I've got over 12 pages of notes here, and I didn't even get to type all my notes out. So this is the remainder of my notes in here. Sleeping bags are under the stairs. Get bedded in tonight because you are going to leave. But I believe you're going to leave blessed because we're going to look at stuff. And I guarantee I'm going to make your head spin at the end of it and go, I did not know that. And that is a statement to make. It probably means that you knew every bit of it and you're not going to know. We're going to look at, and we're either going to look at the question or the answer to the question, why would you cut somebody's thumbs and big toes off? Throw that out there for you all. So let's have a time of prayer, and then we're going to have a time of praise and worship together. So, Lord, we just come before you now, Lord. I'm excited, Lord, for this study. I am, Father. And all that you've shown and all that's gone through this day, Lord, all that has been revealed, Lord, and all that your word has to show us. That's so exciting, Lord. The many layers, Lord, of your word that teaches us so much more about you. So, Lord, tonight let our Bible study not just be interesting, but let it wash over us, Lord, we pray. In your mighty name, Father. Amen.
Good evening. Good evening on the live stream. I'm going to start by singing To Be in Your Presence. To be in your presence, to sit at your feet, where your love surrounds me and makes me complete. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. To rest in your presence, not rushing away, to cherish each moment. Here I will say, this is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. To be in your presence. To be in your presence, to sit at your feet, where your love surrounds me and makes me complete. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. To rest in your presence, not rushing away, to cherish each moment. Here I would stay. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. This is my desire, oh Lord, this is my desire. This is my desire. This is my desire, oh Lord, This is my desire. This is my desire. Oh Lord, this is my desire. Praise you, Jesus. When the music plays, all is stripped away, and I simply come, longing just to bring something that's a worth that will bless your heart. I bring you more than a song, for a song in itself. Is that what you have required? You search much deeper within, through the way things have been. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. King of endless worth, no one could express how much you deserve. Though I'm weak and poor, all I have is yours, every single breath. I bring you more than a song, for a song in itself is not what you have required. You search much deeper within, through the way things have been. You're looking into my heart. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, and it's all about you, all about you, Jesus.
Hallelujah. You know, at the center of all things that we do, it's important to grasp hold of this idea that it is all about the Lord. And that is the center of all things that we do. Tonight, that thought, that concept is challenged the most of all to us in where is the Lord in our lives? Is he at the center? Is he at the periphery? Wherever he is, if he isn't at the center, then all of your world will not spin correctly. It's only when he's right at the center that everything is in its right place. Lord, we just bless you. We pray right now, Lord, speak to us in your mighty name, Father. Amen. 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 Come and join us. Come and join us. Hallelujah. So if you have a Bible with you, and hopefully you do, turn with me to the book of Judges. And we're going to begin something completely new, as they say. And some of the chapters in Judges are long, some are short, some are in the middle. You'll have to decide what this one is. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. So Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand. And they killed 10,000 men of Bezek. And they found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek, and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adoni-Bezek fled and pursued him, and caught him, and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Now the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem, and took it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and they set the city on fire. Afterwards the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who dwelt in the mountains of the south, and in the lowlands. And then Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. And now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they killed Sheshish, Ahiman, and Talmai. Verse 11.
From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kirjath-Sepher. Then Caleb said, whoever attacks Kirjath-Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Achsah as wife. Now it happened when she came to him, and she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you wish? So she said to him, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land in the south. Give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Now the children of the Kenites, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of Palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad. And they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they attacked the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Also Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. So, and they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said. Then he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. Verse 23.
And the house of Joseph sent out spies to Bethel. Now the name of the city before was Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they captured him, and they said to him, please show us the entrance into the city, and we will show you mercy. He showed them the entrance into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man go, and all of his family. The man went into the land of the Hittites, and built a city, and called it the name of Luz, which is the name of to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and the towns of Tanakh, and in the towns nor the inhabitants of Dor, and in the towns nor the inhabitants of Ibelim, and the towns nor the inhabitants of Megiddo, and in the towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. It happened when the Israelites had grown strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, and did not utterly drive them out. Ephraim did not drive out Canaanites who lived in Gezer, but the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun didn't drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nehalol, but the Canaanites lived among them and become subject to the forced law. Anyone want to take over this one?
Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Achor, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Ahilab, Achzib, Helbah, Aphink, or Rehob. So the Asherites dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Anath, but they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them. And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in the mount of Heres, in Ajahalom and Shalbim. Yet when the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. Now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward.
Amen. All you've got to do is say the name absolutely boldly and nobody will question you, whether you got it right or not, in the kind of sense that comes out, because nobody on here is a Hebrew scholar, and anybody who's determined to tell you you pronounced everything wrong, just smile at them as it comes along in the case. So, because we're going to get lots of names, so you're going to get used to these names. And the thing about them is the names are less important as understanding geographical locations, although it's not always true, because to us now, we don't know where these places are mostly. We've got a ballpark region, and at a time, surveyists did go out and try and find these places, but as you know, this is not the safest place in the world at the moment. And that's been true for most of the last 2,000 years. So it's not really a place to go and start looking up where things were and weren't. And things move, things change, places grow. But what it is, it's about settling. So I'm not going to go through the whole idea of historical literature, because hopefully you've all remembered the idea, what history is. That history does teach us about what's going on with Israel, but the actual prophetic message here gives us the future history of the church. So one of the things that's really important moving on to this new book is kind of understanding it a little bit. And we move on to our new book, whilst we're still aware we're looking at historical literature with a prophetic eye for teaching on the future of the church and the kingdom, it's still appropriate for us to remember its place as the next book in the line of books. So historically, and all of the books that are in this kind of section that go all the way up, even Nehemiah and Ezra, they're all, this kind of section in the Bible is all historical literature. Even the book of Ruth is historical literature. It's all there, and it's all there in that sense, although there are little changes in all of them. So it's important that this is the second history book. The first one was Joshua, and are they the only history books that we have? Well, no. Genesis is a history book. Numbers is a history book. Leviticus and Exodus are kind of a history book as well. They've got bits of history in, bits of information that go on. So what defines this group of history books as a different set of history books? Any ideas? As to the Pentateuch? Well, there's two answers to that question. Pardon? Not written by Moses. So there's three answers to that question. It's not written by Moses. That's very true. So they're not written by Moses. The other side of that, of course, is the Pentateuch is directly given by the Lord. So Jewish people say that this is the direct revelation of God. It was written by the finger of God. It was dictated by the Lord, and Moses wrote it down. So it's a direct inspiration that came. So the Genesis history that's written is written by Moses, who didn't live that Genesis history. He's written it. So there's that side, that it's the direct history. And of course the other thing, the big thing is, Joshua onwards concerns being in the land. And in fact, it's only Esther that really concerns being outside of the land in these whole history books. Everything, including Ezra and Nehemiah, all concern what it is to be in the land. And so we're continuing on our series. This whole Bible study series is called From the Promise to the Kingdom, because that's the journey that we're going on together. And it's important to understand, I haven't just come up with that. It's not just clever wording. That's exactly what we're on. We're on this journey from there to here. And so Joshua was about taking the land, and now we turn a page. because the land is taken, but there are still people there who need to be driven out. But now it's about settling. So the journey now is not about taking the land. The journey is about becoming the kingdom. But the king should be Jesus. The king should be the Lord God. He should be the king over the land. And so we're following through on that process of understanding that they're going towards. And if we think about what Samuel comes, when they come and Samuel is dying and they say, your sons are no good, we don't want them to be judges, we don't want any more judges, we want a king now. We know that Samuel knows it's an evil thing that they're asking for. The Lord says it's an evil thing that they're asking for, even though the kingdom of heaven will be a kingdom, even though there's laws in the Pentateuch about a king and what the king should follow, even though God hadn't instituted a kingdom. So the Lord knew that there would be a king, but it was evil for them to choose. So why did they make such a bad decision? Well, we'll know the answer to that when we study these books. The answer to that will come when we start to understand. And I shared this last night. The thing about this history is it's another one of those that kind of belongs to Sunday school teachers. So everybody's favorite, Samson. And all that he does. And probably you know Gideon because you've done a bit of Gideon. And every woman's favorite is Deborah. So everybody knows that Deborah's in there because she's one of the very few female heroines that exists in the Bible. So we like that. Deborah, especially when she says the line that Balak won't fight without her. And she says, right, well then a woman will have the glory and not you. And we'll be coming on to that. And it wasn't Deborah that had the glory, but a woman that had it, an unnamed woman who got all of the glory for killing Sisera. And we can know those little stories. My favorite one, Jephthah. But then we don't know how they all kind of connect together. Because there's a thing about this as a book. It is a historical book. And although it's the next book next to Joshua, the remaining books in our series, apart from 2 Samuel, and even that's a bit of a cheat because originally 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel were just called Samuel. They weren't 1st and 2nd, they were just one book. That all of those books, Samuel, Ruth, and the book of Judges, all overlap in the same time period. They're not separate time periods. So we don't go the book of Judges, and then the book of Ruth, and then the book of Samuel. They all interweave with one another. They're all talking in roughly the same time frame. And in fact, next week we'll be talking about Joshua's death again, and we did that a week ago. So we know that this one also intertwines a little bit about with Joshua. So we have to understand that that time period of the 490 years takes us right the way up to the building of Solomon's temple, from this moment of Joshua's death right the way up there. It's clear to see that Ruth is talking about a narrative which is within the time frame of the Judges. We can see that when Samson is battling against the Philistines, Samson being the last of the judges in the book of Judges, that whilst he's fighting against the Philistines, he's a contemporary with Samuel. So Samson and Samuel exist in the same time frame. And Eli was the high priest. And his sons, Phinehas and Hophni, who were these evil characters who were stealing from the Lord and making it that nobody wanted to go to the house, they were all going on at the same time period. So if we think about that whole narrative, even the idea that the narrative of Samson as the last judge isn't even at the end of the book of Judges. It's in the middle. And there are 3 case studies that come after that. We have the study of the Levite who's from Judah. And immediately that goes, what? Then we have the study of the Levite and his concubine. And then we have the study of the whole of the other tribes taking on the Benjamites in revenge for what they have done, their misdemeanors. And we get the assumption that, well, we've got the time of the Judges, then we have these 3 things. And that's not true either, because those 3 things exist in the narrative of all the times of the Judges. So we have a book that's not entirely chronological. There are parts of it that are, there are parts of it that aren't. It's one of them multi-history books that's sending us all over the place. And there are other history books that really should be within it. And we can ask this kind of question. So why, if all these books are from the same time period, isn't there just one history book? Why are there three when they're all overlapping? Wouldn't it be good to have known that Samson was doing this at the same time as Samuel was doing this? Wouldn't it have been interesting to know that Hannah was praying for Samuel at the same time that Samson's parents were praying for him? Two boys who were born to be Nazarites, two boys whose mother couldn't conceive, two boys whom, visited by an angel of the Lord, their parents were to tell that this was going to happen and this is the case. And yet, we wouldn't know that those two stories are connected. Not from the way that the narrative is set out. And so we might think, or understand, why do we have three different books and not just one, which is in the chronicle order, or chronicle order like the book of Joshua mostly was? And so there are a number of things that we might feel we need to know about this book before we can actually start to look about it. What do we need to know about the book of Judges? And that's to understand that it's just clearly not the history book that comes next. Because there's other history that's not contained that is in other history books. So it's written for a purpose. And that's more than just to tell you what happened next. Because these aren't comprehensive histories. Of the 12 judges that are in here, 6 of them, nothing more is said than they were a judge. And we won't be reading about them taking this tribe on. In fact, some of them didn't even have military battles at all in any way, shape, or form, or take out any enemy. So we understand that there's something quite unusual about the book of Judges as a history book. It's not the conclusive history, it's a history to make a point and to make a narrative. And so we need to understand these things. Because it has to be clear, if there is 3 books which all fit within the same time period, then the reason they're separate is because they individually have something different to tell us. What does Judges have to tell us is going to be the purpose of the next 21 weeks. But the purpose of me saying this to you is for you to understand this is not merely a historical narrative. And maybe you didn't know that before now. Maybe you were approaching this book thinking, well, this is next. This is what's next to Joshua. What comes next is the history of the judges, and then we get through to Saul, David, and I'll get his name out in a minute, Solomon. There he is. And that's really all we need to know about. And these judges are kind of like the leaders, but they're not kings. And that's to completely misunderstand everything that's going on. And to completely misunderstand what the Lord is saying. It's a book with a message. And maybe you hadn't thought about that, but it's important going forward we conclude that the author collated only this history to make a point. He didn't talk about any other history. I mean, if we talk about the 2 books that really conclude this period of time, is Ruth and the book of Judges. Other than their length, what's the real major difference between the 2 of them? Well, one's a really happy book, and one is not. One starts in a good place and ends in a really bad place. One starts in a bad place and ends in a really good place. One talks about going from to needing restoration. The other goes from being bitter to receiving restoration. And so we start to see already a massive difference. And just imagine when we get to Christmas, this Christmas, we'll be talking about the book of Ruth, and we will be ending just before Christmas on that chapter 4 of Ruth, that whole lovely story about everything being restored to Naomi, who changed her name to Bitter, and now she's gone back to being pleasant. I mean, that just sends you off to Christmas in a good mood, doesn't it, really? Especially because I think, if I'm right, it's the 22nd or 20... Yeah, it's the 22nd of December, so it really sends you into Christmas smiling away, which is wonderful. So there's more in it than that. And so the overall message which connects with the individual message of each chapter, and that's shown by the division of the book. You see, the first 3 chapters, or should we say chapters 1 through to 3 verse 8, Well, they give us an introduction as to why there needed to be judges. It's not in historical order. There are things in there that are written that go all the way through the histories. Then chapters 3, verse 9, right the way through to chapter 16, gives us the history of the 12 judges. And then the remaining give us these examples of the nature of the people at the time of these judges and things that were actually going on and the way that people were thinking. Now, part of the understanding that we need to have about this book comes to us from considering who the author of a 350-year history book is. Who might the author be? Is it one author? Is it many authors? Were the judges their own authors, apart from Samson, who died doing his job? Who were the authors? Has anyone got any answers to that question? Anonymous. There's an Anonymous that did it. Anonymous. Well, it's true that nobody signs it. But there are clues in this that help us to understand whom it is. Now, the first one is, it is almost universally agreed that it has a style which shows there was just one author. It's a shared, there's no changes in style of writing. It's very clear. There's just one author. Now, if there's one author for the whole book, when must he have been writing, at least? After. He can't have been writing at the beginning of it, unless he was making it all up. And he can't have been writing in the middle of it, unless he was making half of it up. So it has to have been after the fact. So the author of this book was writing at the end of the 350-year history. Then we get another one. Just have a look at Judges 1:21. What do we read here?
But the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites that have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day.
To this day. So the author is talking about his day now, not the day of that time. So we read in chapter 1 that Judah drove out the inhabitants and burnt the city down. But they came back. And the Benjamites were never able to drive out the Jebusites. In fact, who did drive out the Jebusites? David drove out the Jebusites. David drove out the Jebusites, and Jerusalem became his city. And when did David do it? Well, he didn't do it till Saul was dead, till he'd been made king, and he'd been recognized king by all 12 of the tribes. So we're actually in 2 Samuel chapter 5 territory before that happens. Now, what does that mean to us? Well, it means that after the death of Samson, but before David captures Jerusalem, or Jebus as it was called, to become Jerusalem, at some point in that period, our author lived. So the book of Judges had to be written then. Now take into account that, along with the fact of its prophetic nature of the book, and that it was one author who would have been acquainted with the history of Israel, enough to have been able to study it and know it to be able to write it down. It had to have been somebody who had access to the tabernacle, somebody who had spent most of their life living in that location, that the author of the book of Judges has to be the prophet Samuel. That Samuel wrote the book of Judges. Now that's important to grab hold of that as a fact, rather than as something that is just a statement. It is a fact. Now the reason it fits so well is because of Samuel's calling. Just have a look at 1 Samuel 7 verse 15. What was his calling? 1 Samuel 7:15.
And Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life.
What was Samuel's job? He was a judge. He was another judge. So he was the last judge. Samson wasn't the last judge. Samuel was the last judge. His job was to judge. But he wasn't only just to judge. Have a look at 1 Samuel 8, and let's read verses 1 to 5. It wasn't just that he was a judge.
Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations.
He wasn't just a judge. He was the last judge. And if he was the last judge, and what was to come next was a king, it was important that the period of the judges was documented, that it was put down, but not for the historical knowledge. There was something that Samuel wanted to teach. He was going to be the last of. After him would come the period of kings, and after that would come the exile. So a whole new system of government would be introduced when Samuel would introduce it, and then he would be dead. And that would be the period of the kings. So it was important for him to document it. But Samuel as a judge, well, Samuel's ministry had a difference to all the other judges, especially in the earlier one. Let's have a look at what the Lord said to him when he was a wee lad. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, let's read verses 10 to 21. What was it that he was actually here to do?
The Lord came and called us before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel replied, Speak, your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I am going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family, from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever, because his sons are blaspheming God, and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings. Samuel stayed in bed until morning, then got up and opened the doors of the tabernacle as usual. He was afraid to tell Eli what the Lord had said to him.
To 21.
But Eli called out to him, Samuel, my son. Here I am, Samuel replied. What did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything, and may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me. So Samuel told Eli everything. He didn't hold anything back. It is the Lord's will, Eli replied. Let him do what he thinks best. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and everything Samuel said proved to be reliable. All Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh and gave messages to Samuel there at the tabernacle.
Now, has anybody got that last verse worded differently than that? Yeah.
Then the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord.
There we go. And that's the important key that's here. Now, all of the judges, we'll see this, their job is to restore Israel back. They fall, and they bring them back. They fall, and they bring them back. They fall, and they bring them back. They keep bringing them back to the Lord. But, of course, they fall again. That comes along the line. And actually, each time they fall a little bit further, and they fall worse, and they don't come back as far as they should come back, till the point that the judges, like Samson, were as corrupt as the people they were there to judge. Or like Gideon, who ends up, in the end of his life, being called Jerubbaal, because he starts to worship Baal at the end of his life, starting his life as a mighty man of valor. So we see that there's a real difference between the judges and Samuel. Samuel is given this job, and his job is to be a restorer. And when we get through to this, we will see that Samuel judges the people quite hard. Not harshly, just hard. And his job is to bring the people back. And remember, by the time of Eli, the ark itself has disappeared. It doesn't want to have anything to do with the children of Israel. The whole nation has completely collapsed, and the Philistines are on top. And Samuel's last act is to finish the Philistines off and to restart the engine back at Joshua 24. 350 years to get back to start. But he does it. He's a restorer. So, in the actual fact, as a writer of the book, what that means is that writing the book of Judges, at the time that he's writing it, he is here to show how the Lord and his word, which under Samuel has now returned, it departed. Because quite frankly, a restoration doesn't mean anything if you don't know how bad the car was in the first place. And that's why they always put a before and after photo of the two things, so that you know exactly how much work went into the car. And it's the same here. Well, how much work went into the nation? Here is the before picture. We are in the next 21 weeks looking at how far the nation fell, how far that they went from the Lord. And that's what Samuel was doing. He was setting the image, the picture, so that we could understand why the word of the Lord actually departed in the first place. And that's what the book of Judges is to teach us. Now listen this. This is the exciting thing. It's not how far from God that they fell, but that they fell so far from God. And they constantly hurt him. Yet, he still kept sending people to bring them back. And although this can be considered one of the most depressing books of the Bible next to Job, the exciting thought of that is it's written by somebody who's telling you that the car will look beautiful again. Because he knows that it does. It's been written by somebody who knows it will be restored. Not only knows it's been restored, has done the restoration. It's written by somebody who knows that yes, it got bad, it got really bad, it got so bad, but God never left his people. They just left him, and yet he still kept bringing them back to himself. And this is actually a book that's about the faithfulness of God, even when we are completely unfaithful. And when we think about Hosea and the way that he was told to marry this woman who would be an adulteress and would be unfaithful, and yet in that, Hosea was faithful to her. And that is the process that we have to see. Now, the book of Judges, well, it's actually this parable. Turn with me to Matthew 21, and let's read verses 3 to 39. This is what the book of Judges is. Matthew 21, 33 to 39.
Hear another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, set a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, built a tower, leased it into a tenant farmers, and went on to a journey. When the season from the fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to receive his fruits. The tenants took his servants, beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent one of the other servants more than the first, and they treated them the same. But afterwards he sent them to his son, saying, "They will respect my son." But the tenants, when they saw the son, said among themselves, "This is their heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him.
Amen. So, if the book of Judges and the book of Ruth and the book of Samuel could be considered anything, then it's this. Before conversion, during conversion, and after conversion. That's what we start to see in the things that are going on there. And that's the exciting thought for us. So let's keep that in mind as we look at these next 21 weeks. What is the book of Judges here? Well, it's a history to show us that no matter how far away they went from the Lord always intended on bringing them back. and that we will be seeing that as far as they go, and they go pretty far, we will hear some horrifically terrible things in this book that will surprise you. God still doesn't abandon them. And if you've ever felt that God abandons you because of your sin, although relativism isn't good, in this sense, it's giving you the idea to be able to say, if God doesn't leave his completely unfaithful people, he is not walking away from you either. But he will restore you. So, before we get on to some questions, and I'm sure you've got a shed load of them about this book, let's just quickly ask the question, what do you think chapter 1 is actually for then? Now you know what the book is about, what's the purpose of this first chapter? Any ideas? That's right. And that jumps out really clearly. They were meant to clear everybody out of the land. Those were the conditions. Those were what the Lord said. It's what the Lord said to Moses. It's what the Lord said to Abraham. It's what the Lord said to Joshua. It's what Moses said to the people. It's what the people said to Joshua they were going to do, and they said to Moses they would do, and then Judges 1 tells us they didn't do it. And, it doesn't get much more complex than that. So if this is a book that's really about how did they come to fall, we've got this kind of statement that starts. So if you remember, I said to you, Joshua 23 and 24 really gave us the measuring stick. Ultimately, the rope by which the children of Israel would hang themselves, in the sense the Lord gave them the opportunity. He didn't just set them up. He gave them every experience and opportunity, including his outstretched mighty hand, in order that they may be able to hold on very firmly and do the very thing that they were supposed to do, settle the land. Now, when we've looked at all of the prophets, when we did the Minor Prophets some time ago last year, we were looking at a nation that was walking further and further away from God with every prophet that we got to. Until at the end, when you get to Malachi, it's like two people living in a house that are on the way to being completely divorced because they just don't want to communicate with one another. They just live in the same place. And they kind of play this lip service, but they're pushing themselves away either way. And so what happens in the New Testament period seems quite obvious in the section of where they are. But the reality of that starting here at the beginning, they failed even though the Lord was prepared to fight for them. And this is what the theme of this chapter is outlining. Now next week, what the second chapter will outline is what the Lord then says to the children of Israel, which is a changed message now. I said I would drive them out, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Now they are going to remain like the snakes remained. When in the wilderness wandering, they rebelled against God, and God left the snakes, and in the end he said, now look upon the cross. And it was the case that they would keep getting these nations back to keep looking to the Lord for salvation. And that's what they have to do. So we understand that. And then the reason the author gives for what is to be read in the next 19 chapters of the book is what is declared in the chapter 2. But in all intents and purposes, what we might say is the overview of chapter 1 is exactly what Pam has just said there. It's to set the scene for why the rebuke of the Lord is necessary. Next week we'll see the rebuke of the Lord, and then after that we'll see what happens. But the reason for next week is born out of what we see this week. And that reason is found in verses 19 right through to 36, that every single one of the 12 tribes from Judah onwards left somebody in that they shouldn't. Even when you look at this guy who they find at Luz, before they call it Bethel, and they just let one guy live, he goes off and he sets up a city under the exact same name, like you clear out all the weeds out of your garden and you leave just one, and the next thing you know, they're all back again. Here he is. And the understanding of why the Lord said, wipe them all out. Which sounded very Star Wars then. But wipe them all out. Because just one was enough to keep it going. Now that lesson would be learned by Esther, because Saul was told to kill all of King Agag's descendants and all of the Amalekites. But he leaves one of Agag's children alive. And some 1,000 years later, one of his descendants, an Agagite by the name of Haman, plans the destruction of the entire nation. Because it only takes one. God knows what he's doing, and we have to trust in him. So we could see that whole setup. It's very clear what's going on here. And they simply didn't do the thing that the Lord had asked them, that Joshua had told them, that Moses had reminded them, and that they had promised they would do. And if they didn't do this, then the elders and the leaders whose job it was to drive forward the conquest, this is what Joshua told them. We have to remind ourselves. Let's have a look at Joshua 23. And let's read verses 4 to 13. Here we see what the Lord said.
See, I have apportioned to you these nations which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have cut off from the Jordan even to the great sea towards the setting of the sun. And the Lord your God, he shall thrust them out from before you and drive them from before you, and you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God promised. Be very firm then to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, in order that you may not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you, and as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000, for the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you associate with them, and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you.
Now that's what they did. That's what the Lord did. And that's what will happen to them. So we know that to be true. So this chapter is less about what they didn't do, because we can see what they didn't do. It's really about why is it that they didn't do it. I mean, if we establish that Judges is a continuation history, but rather a book with a message to show us just how far they fell, so they know how far they come back from under Samuel's restoration, then the answer as to why they fell, really, what we're looking at here is the Genesis decision. What was the first decision? And if we're talking about how we might not fall so far from God, then there's a real interesting study for us to say, well, it would be nice to know what was the wrong decision that they made, so we don't make the same wrong decision along the lines. And whatever that decision or decisions were the children of Israel made, which meant that in the end they fell so hard. Now, bearing in mind, I'm saying this one decision isn't all, therefore all their decisions were built off this one. It was the beginning of. So it's not that they just kept making this one decision over and over again. They made lots of bad decisions. But what was the first bad decision? What was the first bad decision? What made them not do? There wasn't even one of the tribes that could say, well, we did it. At the time of the golden calf, at least the Levites could say, well, we didn't bow down. We kept ourselves from it. There wasn't even one that could say it this time. Not one of them managed to succeed. And Moses told them they wouldn't, and Joshua told them that they wouldn't, and they said, no, we will. And now they've proved that they haven't. In fact, sheer pig-headedness would say, you would do it just to prove Joshua and Moses wrong, wouldn't you? I'll prove them wrong. Tell me I can't do it. Kind of along the line. So what is the bad decision? And that's really what the first chapter shows us. But That's what's found in Joshua 1:19 to 36. So what are the first 18 verses for then? How do they kind of feed into that? Especially in connection with all that we've established. And what we read is Judah, along with Simeon, on a series of conquests that all seem to go very well. Quite well, in fact. In Judges 1:8, we see them taking Jerusalem and burning it to the ground. A place that we know, well, it wasn't even going to belong to them. It was going to be given to Benjamin. It was in Benjamin's territory. So here we have the tribe of Judah not just fighting for themselves, fighting for their neighbors. Very good of them. Then we see a repeated Joshua 15 and Caleb taking the hill again. He was given by Moses, and his nephew Nathaniel earning the hand of the bride. We already know what that's about. Then we see in verse 16 the Canaanites. Does anyone know who the Canaanites are? Or Canaanites, if you want to say Canaanites. Something to do with Jethro. What do you think they're to do with Jethro? You're whispering, you know. They are his direct descendants. So they're his sons. So Jethro was the high priest of Midian. He was a Midianite. And the Midianites were descendants of Abraham. They were some of Abraham's other children. But the Canaanites were Jethro's direct children. And they went with the children of Israel through the wilderness. They lived in the wilderness previously, so they knew the area. They went with them on the journey, and seemingly they also came into the promised land with them. So they were always Israel's friend. And they were always very good to them. And they'd come on the journey, and clearly they'd also taken some of the land of Judah. And then finally we see Judah and Simeon taking the fight over to the Philistines and driving them out of Gaza. That's something that you could get yourself on BBC News for saying now out of the pulpit and going, and Jerusalem drove into Gaza. They went in and they seized the territory. UN, call the UN. And we see that in verses 1 to 18. And then, of course, we start driving into the failure to drive out all the inhabitants, and how all the tribes failed to drive them out. So why do we have those quite bright and sparkly 18 verses, all these lovely victories that are going on against the Lord Bezek and all of these kind of things that are going on? Now, some argue that what these first 19 verses show us is, well, for a small time period, they tried really hard. They did try really hard. And they were doing really well. It's just they weren't really able to sustain it for very long. But they did try. So we have 18 verses of them trying, and then 21 chapters of them failing. And some people genuinely believe that, well, we start on a high so that we can, when we finish on a low, we know at least at the beginning they meant well. They were really going to go for it, and they were really kind of getting that. Now, I don't deny that. They certainly did go for it. The Lord was with them. The Lord fought for them, and the Lord told Judah he would fight for them. So there is very much a truth in the idea of that. And that way of thinking, it fits into so many people's narrative, Christian narrative, when they think about themselves, when they think about their daily, weekly, monthly, sometimes hourly battle, when it comes to our kind of conflict with sin, that we get so far, we have a good couple of hours or days or weeks or months, and then we have a setback. So we have to kind of get up off the mat and start again. Now, if that's what is being shown, then what we would conclude from it all is that if the first thing that went wrong is that they had a setback, if the first thing that went wrong, which has caused the rest of the tragedy that is the book of Judges, is that they slipped and fell short of the glory of God, then is that what we're saying is, when we accept Jesus as Savior, we need to have a really good long run, because the minute that we have our first setback, we're going to fall just as hard as Israel did. Don't worry, God will restore you. But we're going to go so far from the Lord because we've had our setback. Unfortunately, that's how so many Christians feel. It's how some of them are taught. In somehow or a way to try and cause them not to sin by scaring the living daylights out of them. If they do sin, God is going to drop a ton of bricks on you like you've never felt. But friends, that's just not the right way of thinking. It doesn't fit with the understanding of the mercy of God. It doesn't understand with what the cross teaches us about our sins being paid for. No, I'm not advocating liberality that says you can do and can do whatever you want. But I will challenge to the hilt the idea that if you have fallen short of the glory of God, if you are repentant, that God will not restore you. God will restore you, and that restoration is an immediate. And there are plenty of people in our church who can testify of that very true fact, that they have seen, they have walked away, sometimes for a whole decade. And then the minute they turn back to God, within a year, everything is restored back to them and beyond their own imagination and what they could have affected, because the Lord does do all of those things. The idea that if you are struggling with sin will preclude you or even lead to your destruction is so ludicrous, but it's dangerous, because the purpose of it, the enemy telling you that, even if it is out of the mouth of the person on the pulpit, is to stop you doing what God created you for. If he can't get you to stop doing it, if he can't tell you can't do it, then he'll tell you that you're not good enough to do it. Whatever he can do to stop you doing it. So don't fall into that trap. It's contrary to Israel's history, anyway, because they did fall so many times, and God still kept using it. And even when they went for the exile, he still called them back. Because the point of this book is not to show how far you fall, it's to show there's always a way back. Always a way back. And of course, if they did slip and they did fall, and if that's the reason for the bad 21 chapters that follow, what is the decision that they made anyway? Which, of course, is what we're trying to establish. So clearly, these first 19 chapters aren't to show us, well, it went well for a while and then it fell apart. The decision and the reason for the first 19 verses is shown. It's shown you. And we see it actually in the first two verses. You might not realize you're seeing it, but it says, "Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand." Did Joshua die before his job was finished? What was Joshua's job? What was Joshua called to do? Get them into the land, but what was he called to do once they were in the land? Divide it. He had a job that Moses didn't have, that Paul didn't have, that David didn't have, that Solomon didn't have. He had a unique calling. His job was to divide the land. He used everybody to fight so that they owned the territory, and then he divided it, and he took the calling and he individualized it into each tribe. And now that Joshua is dead, in their infinite wisdom, the children of Israel said, let's reinvent Joshua. Let's do what Joshua did again. Who shall go up for us first? No one should go up for you first. You have been given your territory. Go and do your job. Go and do the job that God has called you to. Don't look for somebody else to do your job. You do what God has called you to do. They asked of the Lord who should fight for us. Now you might say, well, the Lord didn't answer back. Fight for your own, for yourself. Because the Lord answers them back, send Judah. Because he knows their nature. Go on, sir. No. And Simeon. Yeah, that's right. And you're right there. So even in that process, So the two issues, the two highlights, the first one is they were getting somebody else to do their job. So why then did the Lord not say that to them? Why did the Lord say, send Judah? Isn't that a contradiction? And the answer is no. The Lord gave it to Judah because he was preempting the future. Who would be the ruling tribe? It would be Judah. It would be out of Judah that would come the kings. But he wasn't just preempting what would happen. He was drawing from what had already been said. Have a look at Genesis 49 and verse 8. This is where Jacob spoke over all of his sons. Genesis 49 verse 8.
Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hands will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down before you.
They are the royal tribe. They are the tribe of the Lion of Judah. And the deeper meaning that will come from this is understanding the Lord sends Judah. So that's the first one. The second one, the Lord told Judah the land was delivered. It's delivered into your hand, but they didn't take it all. What is the Lord saying is delivered into their hand? What land? Just Judah's land? The land, the whole land. So not only did they fail to take their own land, they failed to take all of the land. Or you could put it the other way around. They didn't just fail to take all of the land, they failed to take their own land. They stood on the promise of the Lord that he had delivered it into their hands. And yet, in a sense, as Judah was replacing Joshua, the Lord made the same promise to him. Be strong and be courageous. I have delivered the land into your hands. And of course, we know he wasn't at first, but he became strong and courageous. All they needed was the faith to believe this. But Judah did take most of their own land. They didn't take much of anybody else's, though. And in fact, the only land of other peoples that they did take was land that was on the periphery of their land. Because what's happening here is something that we will start to see all the way through the book. They're making a decision. In other words, their charity only stretched as far as it was valuable to them. They were only prepared to do the right thing whilst the right thing benefited them. They were only prepared to serve the Lord and go as far as they wanted to go with the Lord, whilst what the Lord wanted suited what they wanted. And think about that. Think about the calling of the Lord. Think about the way that the Lord speaks into your life. Think about how far so many people are only willing to serve the Lord as long as it's in line with what they want and not necessarily what the Lord wants. Paul wanted to reach Jews, but the Lord wanted him to reach Gentiles. So he gave it over to the Lord in that case. Now, who did they fight for? Well, they fought for Simeon's land. Why did they fight for Simeon's land? Because it was inside their land. So we'll fight for that because that has an effect on us. They took the Philistines' land. Why? Because Gaza's on the border of Judah. They took Jerusalem because Benjamin was the next tribe to them. This selfishness is a trend which we will see, which at times actually develops into outright civil war, and in one occasion, outright civil war in a tribe. Because putting self first, if you put self first, and because they put self first, it meant that the ties of the nation would begin to disintegrate. The 12 tribes would start to turn into 12 separate nations, instead of remaining one nation. Now have a look at verse 34 of Judges chapter 1. What do we see there? It says this, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. The Danites couldn't even take their own land. So the land that they'd been given, they couldn't even get into it because they couldn't drive the Amorites out. So they were really struggling to be able to do what they needed to do to take the land that God had given them. But if you look at verse 35, what you read is that the tribes of Joseph were actually able to take those cities. The very cities that Dan couldn't take, Manasseh and Ephraim did. Did they turn around and say, don't worry, Dan, we've done it for you? We've been able to take them. Here are the cities that God has given to you. No. What they did is they took those cities and then they said to the Ammonites, yeah, stay in them. But now you need to pay us tribute. The selfishness of that act took a promise that God was giving to somebody else and removed it from them in order that they could benefit. These are the decisions that they were making. And this is why the fall began. This is what we read here in this scripture. What were they doing? Well, they were putting themselves first. They were not thinking of the nation. They were not thinking of the Lord. They were thinking of themselves. And later in Judges 18, we'll read that Dan starts looking for somewhere else to live. In the end, he becomes homeless. He rejects the promise that God has given him. And because he does, when you get to the 144,000 in the book of Revelation, which tribe isn't there? Dan. And Manasseh could have helped them. And Ephraim could have helped them. But there was money to be made. And so Dan wasn't there at the end. That gives you the sense of why the book of Judges is the book of Judges. These are the decisions made. To get someone else to do it for them, to not fight or care for one another beyond their own interests. These decisions come from you making yourself more important than anything else. Where God's will is only okay up to the point of your will, and where your needs come first before your neighbour's needs. Now, if that's your line of thinking, then the law of God is going to be eventually rejected, shut up, and hidden away. Why? Well, have a look at Matthew 22. Let's read verses 36 to 40. Matthew 22, 36 to 40. And once you've got it, you give it a good read.
Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? He said to him, you are to love the Lord with all your hearts, with all your soul, and all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. A second likewise is this, you are to love your neighbour as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments.
Everything hangs from the statements to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself. And if you do those two things, then the law makes sense. If you put the Lord first and everybody else second and you third. But if you put you first and the Lord and your neighbour in any other number after you first, then none of it makes sense. You won't be able to sustain it. And what will happen is it doesn't matter how good your intentions are, the whole thing will disintegrate. Because it only works when you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. They reject the law. If we reject that law, the law of love, then you too will fall far from the Lord. Not out of the Lord. You'll only fall out of the Lord if you give him up. But if you reject putting the Lord first and your neighbour second, then you are going to fall away and your fall will go far. And you will read in here, in these 21 chapters, a fairly decent fall. And you will end up losing everything. So if you think about that, Judges 1 teaches us something that Jesus says that people find hard. Have a look at Luke chapter 9, and let's read verses 23 to 25. And this is the summing up of chapter 1 in this chapter. Luke chapter 9, verses 23 to 25.
He said to them all, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, the same will save it. For what does it profit a person if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits his own self?"
Put yourself first, you'll lose it all. Put the Lord first and your neighbour second, and you'll gain everything that's of worth. That's what chapter 1 is to teach us. And that is what they rejected. They'd been given a promise. They'd been given something to do. But they were only prepared to do it as far as it was of interest and of value to them. Let's not fall into that. So, here's some truth for you about this scripture. It's written by a prophet. So it has a deeper meaning. One of the things that's exciting about this book is its deeper meaning, because there's more detail in these events as described than to teach the above lessons. There's more in it than just to teach what I've taught. What and why? Well, we're tapping into the prophetic nature of this book. It's written by the first person to hold the title prophet. The man who literally wrote the book on how to be a prophet. And the person who actually set up the school on how to be a prophet and how to write prophetic literature. So when we read prophetic literature, Samuel taught people how to do it. So we're reading one of the first examples of it. And prophetic literature is born out of the school, and it's out of Samuel's teaching. As such, we shouldn't be surprised that the detail gives us the understanding needed to get the message of the literature, but then the detail also gives us a deeper prophetic understanding of what the Lord's overall plan is. See, we're seeing something in these scriptures that's exciting, and I'll give you an example. Remember, Jewish prophecy is patterned in that midrashic style. Just how Jesus and Paul taught it is how the prophet would write. There is a prediction, then there are many fulfillments, and then there's a final fulfillment. There are types, and there are part fulfillments, and there are examples. So let's have a look at just one to help us understand. Judges 1:2 tells us that Judah and Simeon will fight together. Now, you've already said it, and it's quite right. The Lord said, Judah, go and fight. And Judah said, Simeon, come and help me. Now, we've already established that the reason that Judah asked Simeon to come and help him, and then said, I'll come and help you, is because it was in the interests, because Simeon don't own their own inheritance. They have towns inside of Judah. They didn't get their own land. Now, you might be thinking, why don't they get their own land? And that did come out in the Joshua 10 through to 21. Why didn't they get it? Because what it sounds is like it's just like Levi. Levi got towns, except that Levi got towns in everybody's territory. Simeon just got towns in Judah's territory. Why? Well, let's go back to what Jacob said to his sons again. Let's have a look at Genesis 49, and let's read verses 5 to 7.
Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. 5 to 7. Simeon, let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honour be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
The Lord said he was going to scatter them. Why did he? What did they do wrong? Can you remember? What did Levi and Simeon actually do? That's right. So, because the son of the king of the city they were dwelling next to raped their daughter, their sister, they took a And the guy said, well, let your women marry our men, and our men marry your women, which is the same thing, or somewhere along those lines. And Levi and Simeon came up with a plan, and they said, well, we couldn't possibly do that. Well, you're not circumcised. So you guys need to get circumcised. So they circumcised them without anesthetic and with just a flint stone. And in those periods of time where the men were recovering, Simeon and Levi, along with their own herdsmen and men of war, went through the city, and the men who were just not up to swinging a sword in any way, shape, or form at all were all butchered. They killed the entire city. It was an act of absolute wrath that was poured out on it. And the curse on them, you won't get your own territory. Now, that statement sounded like absolute nonsense. Because by the time that the children of Israel left Egypt, Simeon was the second largest tribe. Have a look at Numbers 1:23 as to how many were there. Yeah.
Those who were numbered of the tribe of Simeon were 59,300.
Second largest. The only larger than them was Judah. Now have a look at Numbers 26:14. How many were left when they came to enter the promised land? Numbers 26:14.
These are the families of the Simeonites, 22,200.
They lost 30,000 people. How did they lose 30,000 people? Did they get lost? Did they take a different direction? They ended up in China? What happened to half the tribe, more than half the tribe of Simeon? And the answer is Baal Peor. When Balaam said to Balak, send your women down there with no clothes on. In fact, it was the son of Simeon, a prince of Simeon, who came with a girl right in front of Phinehas and took her into his tent, that Phinehas lost his rag, picked up a spear, flew into the tent, and stabbed the man into the woman, and the woman was called Cosby, and lifted her up. Simeon fell hard, so hard that they became the smallest tribe, even smaller than Levi. What the Lord had said through Jacob became true. Simeon was now scattered. They'd gone from being the second largest tribe to being the smallest, and all that was left was a remnant. Now take that and let's connect it with what we're seeing here in Judges. Well, if we take this idea of a remnant of a tribe of Israel, then couple it with what the word Simeon means, which is the ones who heard, or the hearers, what we can say is the remnant of the ones who heard are now found in Judah. And since Judah fought for them and with them, it is significant because we understand that Judah is a derivative of Joshua. And Joshua is the Hebrew form of Jesus. So what we're actually seeing here is a tribe that was once strong, a nation that was once strong but fell hard due to idolatry, a remnant of Israel. Only those who heard would be found in Jesus. We've just seen the history of Israel because Samuel's a prophet. And in telling us one story, he gives us the history of the entire nation. These would go on to take the land, and all the rest of Israel refused to fight, but these agreed to. That's describing the future of Israel right up to the tribulation period. The remnant of only those who would hear will be found in the midst of Jesus. And he will fight for them, and they will fight with him. That's exciting, isn't it? So, let's see if there's any more in here. What has jumped out at you that you want to know about? Use your microphones so the people who are on the live stream can hear what you're going to ask. What has jumped out at you from this? Do you have any questions, any bits you want to know? Because we haven't looked very much at the detail. Go for it.
The question about why they cut his toes and thumbs
Why
off.
did they cut off the big toe and the thumbs? That's a bit gruesome, isn't it, really? Here we read it here at the beginning, and it's good. So this is all surrounded around the character Adoni Bezek. Now, Bezek means thunder. So I've been joking up to now. Adoni means Lord. Bezek means thunder. This is the Lord of Thunder. So we're actually reading about Thor here. For those of you who are Marvel fans, this is a whole story about Thor. And no, it isn't about Thor at all. But here's this character called the Lord of Thunder. If you're going to call your son a name, you can't do better than the Lord of Thunder. That's where you're going to go. There you go. What's your name, son? Lord of Thunder. I remember being in a primary school when we were doing an assembly, and we got a young man to come out, and we asked him a question, gave him the microphone. So you have to speak up a little bit. What's your name? I said, no, you're going to have to speak up because nobody can hear. What's your name? He went, Fazil! 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 And 9/11 had just happened. So be careful what you ask. Like that. Just like that. Seriously. People were scared. But so here's the Lord of Thunder. That's a great name. Now, it's a more significant statement when we understand that thunder has a meaning. Have a look at Revelation chapter 10 and let's read verses 1 to 4. I am going to get onto your thumbs and toes, by the way. But we need to understand about Bezek before we get onto thumbs and toes. It does. I keep wanting to go. Revelation 10 verses 1 to 4.
I saw another mighty angel coming down out of the sky, clothed with a cloud. A rainbow was on his head, his face like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He had in his hand a little open scroll. He set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. He shouted with a loud voice as a lion roars. When he shouted, the seven thunders uttered their voices. When the seven thunders sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from the sky saying, seal up the things which the seven thunders had said, and do not write them.
It's the only thing that still remains sealed. The thunders that spoke. Now, what are the thunders that spoke? Well, in Psalm 29 is a psalm all about thunder. Whenever there was thunder, they would sing Psalm 29. And it tells you about the seven thunders. But it actually just tells you what the reaction to the seven thunders are. And since John wasn't allowed to tell us what the seven thunders said, well, what is that? Well, let's have a look at John chapter 12. And let's read verses 28 to 29, because who are the thunders that are speaking? John 12, 28 to 29.
Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Therefore the people who stood by and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him.
Because it's the voice of God. When people hear the voice of God, continually hear them go, is it thundering? That doesn't mean that every time you hear thunder, it is God speaking, by the way, and you have no faith. Therefore, you don't understand what God is saying to you. But in this time, that as God spoke, it sounded to them as thunder. John isn't saying it was thunder. He said it sounded like thunder. And so when we hear thunder, we're talking about the voice of God, somebody who's speaking. Now let's go back to Judges. He is Adoni Bezek. Well, it's clearly not the Lord, even though his name is Lord. And who's he fighting against? Well, he's fighting against Judah, who's a type of Jesus. So the Lord of Thunder is fighting against Jesus. Therefore, he's fighting against it. And who's fighting with Jesus? A remnant. So the remnant and Jesus are fighting against the Lord of Thunder. Who could this be? Well, it's a false Lord, clearly. One who sounds like the Lord. So let's have a look at Revelation 13:11. Let's see a character who this could be. Revelation 13:11.
I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon.
So it's a beast that came out of the earth that looked like a lamb, but it spoke like the dragon. So he looked like Jesus, and he sounded like Jesus, but what he was saying was actually from the enemy. Who was he? He's the false prophet. So what we're seeing here is the false prophet, because that character then tells everybody to worship the beast and to build an image of the beast, which is the kingdom. It's not an actual beast that climbed out of the sea. It's a kingdom. Worship the kingdom. Worship that kingdom. When you start hearing people talking about nationalism, you watch it and fear it. We don't belong to this country. We belong to the kingdom of heaven. And that nationalism and jingoism about worshipping that, this is what the false prophet does. So it's a conflict. And in this conflict, we see all kinds of signposts. In Judges 1:4, we see the victory of Judah over Bezek is that 10,000 men. Now, 10,000 men is a nice round number to kill. I'm going to count up and go, don't kill that one, that would be 10,001. We've got to that number. There's a guy with a clicker counter going on. Is he dead? Of course it is. It's a number that has a significance. And the significance is taught to us in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses taught to us. Just turn to Deuteronomy 32 and verse 30. Because it's a very specific number. But it is a number you see a lot in Scripture, 10,000.
How could one chase 1,000 and put 10,000 to flight unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had surrendered them?
See, it's a specific number that means something very specific, and that specific is that you can only get that level of victory if the God is for you. In other words, it's a number that surrounds a victory in the Lord. When the number of the victory is 10,000, it's because the victory was given by God. So here we have Judah, a type of Jesus, fighting against Adoni-Bezek, a type of the false prophet, and he has got a victory from God. He's finished him off. In fact, so much so that he's cut his thumbs and his big toes off. But prior to that, what Adoni-Bezek says, well, it's a fair cop because I did it to 70 other people. I took 70 kings of men, and I cut their big toes and thumbs off. Now, what does that mean? Why cut somebody's big toes off and thumbs off? I had an uncle who had no big toes. I never got a straight answer to the day of his death of him why he had no big toes. I had 15 different stories given to me. From his Alsatian ate them while he was asleep one day, that he lost them when he was in the merchant navy, to a forklift truck tore them off. I have no idea how he probably lost them to gangrene or something like that. I know my uncle. Probably cirrhosis of the liver finished them off. But the whole element is that he never had them. So he had to have special shoes fitted, otherwise he couldn't stand up. Because the minute he took them off, he had no balance. Now, if you think about your big toes holding you up, I tried to get Mike to do this earlier, and he determined to prove me wrong. So it's hard to do, I am prepared to cut your toes off, son, just to prove the point that comes along. Just get me the scissors. It'll be quick. And what we'll do is if you take them off, there is no balance. You need them to balance. Your toes won't do it. You have to have them, and you cut them together. Now, take your thumbs off and try and eat. Try and use a knife and fork. Try and write with a pen. Try and do anything. That's why that advert about cats developing thumbs is the old milk advert. So that they could say the cats have got thumbs now, they can open the doors. Actually, it's surprising what you need your thumbs for. Evolutionists declare that it was the development of the thumb that made us the far advanced species above things, because we could now grip hold of things that come along the line. But either way, take your thumbs off and take your toes off, and you are bound. You can't, it's not that you can't go anywhere. You're not bound as in you could run off if you want, but you can't do anything on your own. For the rest of your life, you are now somebody who is reliant on another. You are now reliant on other people. You have been made thoroughly disabled. You can't walk, you can't pick anything up. You're now bound to the one whose table you are at. Now, fair enough, they weren't sat at the table, they were under the table. They were eating like the dogs, so they were made to be lowly. But when you are sat at somebody's table, this is an act of worship. Because if we remember in the Old Testament, worship wasn't about singing, it was about eating. The Lord dined. The Lord dined. He inhabited our praises. He ate. He got the fat. He got the tasty bit of the meat. We got the rest. That was his. He sits at our table. All the references to worship are about food. So if one day Mark pulls out the barbecue and not his guitar, it will be a glorious day. That's it, friend. I'm going to play something different this morning. I'm going to put some shrimps on the barbie. As it comes. But that's the element that comes out there. So there's a whole thing here. We've got these kingdoms of men, and they were constantly for 70 years. Now that number 70 has to jump out at you as well. It's a number of completion, but it's also the number from Daniel's vision. It will be 70 weeks till the Lord would restore the kingdom to Israel. So for that 70, they were always under the control of that false prophet. But then one day Judah would come and would release them from that bondage by taking that false lord and making him in bondage, binding him up, which is exactly what the Lord will do to the false prophet. He will bind him. He will be bound up. And he'll be destroyed. When will he be destroyed? When he's brought before Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. So we see again. What we might say is the images of 70 years where kings were bound to this false prophet worship, but now Adoni-Bezek is bound in the same way. And when the bride returns, he is destroyed. For the false prophet and the beast are cast into the lake of burning fire. Does that answer your question? Does anybody else have anything that's jumped out of them?
Is there any particular reason why you've got the same story about the daughter again?
Yeah, that's it. So can
no,
you
we
all
had a reason.
remember the Caleb and Othniel story? It was repeated. We looked at it in Joshua 15. And it was this lovely little story that really kind of comes where Caleb, who's this Gentile character that was adopted into the family, he gets given because he was one of the only faithful ones. Now, just to recap, that's how you got it. Caleb is the Gentile who's adopted into the family of Judah. He becomes its faithful servant. And this reminds us of a church that's grafted into the natural root. The narrative of Othniel gives us a little bit more. Othniel would be a judge, and all the judges are a type of Christ. Caleb offers his daughter, the Gentile bride, to one who can climb Hebron and destroy the people of Kiriath Sepher, which would be later named Debir. And Debir means the sanctuary. So, the son, this man is fighting for the bride, and he has to climb up the holy hill to the sanctuary. Only Jesus is able to do that. So it's a type of Christ. He must ascend the hill to the sanctuary. He must ascend the holy hill in order to gain the Gentile bride. Othniel, that name means the Lion of God. It's another one of Christ's names. And the bride asks of her father if she may have springs of water. And she gets off her ride, bows to ask. The bride asks in humility for springs of living water for the Holy Spirit. Ask, seek, and knock. So I've already shared that with you before. Why repeat it again? See, in Joshua, we got it there because we were understanding that before Israel gets given her land, they are given the story of a Gentile bride and a Gentile adoption. So before they get their promise, they need to know the Gentiles are also going to get a part of this. That doesn't need to be taught again. And here in Judges, something happens to the story. Caleb is replaced for Judah at the beginning of it. It's Judah that's taking the hill, not Caleb that's taking the hill now. They swapped him around. Now it's the same story, but this time in the narrative, it's shown as Judah as the type of Jesus who's fighting against the Canaanites, which is this seven-headed kingdom, like the beast that climbs out of the sea. Now we start to see another connection with the Lord. And now the groom taking Debir, meaning sanctuary, means more because it was Judah, a type of Jesus. So we start to see that. We start to see here that it is Judah that is brought in this because it's the same story. Now here gives us an understanding of prophecy being patterned. It's the same story. It has the same meaning, but it taught this to the Jews, and now it teaches this, that it's only in Jesus that that kingdom will be destroyed. And those things will be collected. Does that answer your question? Then would you have a bit more of that? Go on.
So Caleb Caleb's obviously just one man.
Yeah.
Caleb,
If you got the story from Joshua 15,
yeah,
you would assume that it was Caleb and his family that did it.
right,
The story, as it's shown in Judges 1, was it was all of Judah
right.
that were a part of it. But the land was given to Caleb.
Yeah, so it was just Joshua was kind of like narrowing in.
Yeah, because we were being taught something here.
Yeah.
Prophecy is pattern. And the message that we need to learn at the certain time is what we need to learn. Same story. Meaning. About that. That's a challenge. That often there are, for a reason, it's different. Why is it different in it? There isn't. It is an economy of effort in the Bible, so why repeat it? So anything else? Anybody? You had a question earlier, I know you did.
You answered it.
You had another one. So,
No, you answered it.
the Simeon one, wasn't it? Yeah.
Simeon and Judah. Why Simeon and Judah?
Yes. Anybody else got anything that jumps out?
What a thought.
Go on, throw a thought at me.
Because of how this has started, and obviously there's a massive decline already in them being completely and totally selfish, is this then some justification for Reuben, Gad and half the tribe of Manasseh building the altar?
In the fear that what was coming on.
Or would they, what I'm trying to say is, could they see something?
Well, they knew it, didn't they? They said it at the same time. However, the problem was the Lord had already got that altar built.
Mm.
It was the 12 stones.
Mm.
They didn't need to go and do it themselves. What we learned from that civil war kind of sense was the problem that they were all speaking for God, but none of them were listening to him. And none of them had even acquired of him. So I think you're right in the sense that the nature of who they were. Now, bearing in mind, we haven't yet got to the phrase, and a generation arose.
Mm.
This is the same generation that did cross the Jordan, that did see the feeding in the wilderness, that did see all the miraculous nature. It didn't take long for them to say, mine.
But that's not what I was trying to say as well, is that's not what Reuben, Gad and Manasseh did they? They fought for them.
Yes. They did. They went over it. But that wasn't their initial thought. Their initial thought was, we're happy where we are. And it wasn't until Moses said, the Lord will not have that they changed their tune. They did change the tune. And they came back and said, all right, well, we'll go and fight. And they gave up 5 years. And if we remember, we looked at that. They were like, make sure you remember who we are. They did, but their initial thought wasn't. So, again, it's another one of those things. It's easy to kind of point at Israel and say, well, see what they were like. But the actual truth is that same level of selfishness, it exists. We see it in the churches everywhere. And I'm sure every one of us can point to occasions or times where we've been in churches, even maybe times in this church, where you are looking at people who are far more interested in themselves than they are in loving the Lord their God of all their heart, all their soul, and loving their neighbour as themselves. Bearing in mind that we're on a journey, and the levels of that and the levels of faith to do that are set. And certainly isn't something to beat people over the head for and going, I'm prepared to give up this, why aren't you? Because everybody's on their own different journey. Be the change that you want to see is the line that comes back. But yes, that's a good observation. Okay, so nobody's got anything else to point out. Why are the Canaanites in here? Why has Ken arrived? Because who are they? Who are they? And we've already established who they are. Now, you're wondering where I'm looking at here. Well, we see it down here. Let me get to the right place here. In verse 16. Now the children of the Canaanite, Moses, his father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad. And they went and dwelt amongst the people. This is the one thing we don't see Judah and Simeon being a part of. See the Canaanites just doing their own thing. Here they are. Who are they? Well, they're the guys that went on the same journey. They saw the wonders of the Lord. They decided to go with the children of Israel through the wilderness. They weren't Jewish people, but they did reside in the camp. Therefore, they were under the protection of the Lord. And as we see here in the text, they clearly crossed over the Jordan and they settled in the deserts of Judah. Now, the thing about the Canaanites is they were a nice group of people. They were always a friend to Israel. They helped them in the wilderness because they lived there before, so they knew where all the water was. They knew where this, that, and the other were. Even though the Lord was feeding them supernaturally, the Canaanites knew how they could survive without the Lord, because they knew how to survive without the Lord in the wilderness. As they knew the land, and it's a Canaanite woman who would kill Sisera with Deborah and Barak. So they're always there. They're the smiley, happy people living in our land. Why wouldn't we be nice? It's lovely to have them. You go and you see it, Canaanites, they're always smiling, happy people. Just make your day. Lovely. So Judah doesn't seem to have a problem with them having a little part of their own territory, even though they didn't have to give them any of their territory. That's Judah, top dog, very nice. Being well behaved again. But there's always something a bit fishy about the Canaanites. Never trust anybody that's always smiling. No, I'm joking. There is something fishy about them as a group because although they're always Israel's friend, they're also everybody else's friend. And they're very quick to make peace with anybody that Israel's at war with. They're never at war with anybody. They're friendly. They're nice. They constantly are at peace with everybody. And what gives us away that the Canaanites were not necessarily a good group is that when Balaam was trying to curse the people of God, God kept putting in his mouth that he cursed the enemies of the people of God. And unfortunately, one of those groups of people that came out of Balaam's mouth were the Canaanites. Just turn with me to Numbers 24. Let's read verses 21 to 22 and hear what Balaam says about them. Numbers 24, 21 to 22.
He saw the Canaanites and spoke his message. Your dwelling place is secure. Your nest is set in a rock. Yet you Canaanites will be destroyed when Asher takes you captive.
So here Balaam sets what will be their destruction. The captivity of Assyria. Which is a long way from this period of time. They're going to be captured by the Assyrians. And they're going to be dragged away. And that seems obvious because, well, if they're residing with the children of Israel, when the children of Israel are captured by the Assyrians, they'll be captured too, and they'll be taken away. Except the Assyrians carried away the northern tribes. And the Canaanites are in Judah. They should be safe in the rock, it says. They've made a nest for themselves in the rock. They've made a home for themselves in the rock. But when the enemy comes, they're not safe. Even though they're in the rock. The rest of us, when we're in the rock, when we run into our strong tower, we are saved, but not the Canaanites. They're nesting on the rock, but they're not safe. They are one of the only groups that are taken out of Judah and captured and bred out of existence and are destroyed. What is the charge? Well, they're nesting in the rock, but it seems they're not of the rock. They're just nesting on top of it. They don't belong to the rock. They're not in the rock. The rock isn't their rock. It's not where their feet are set upon, but they are nesting on top of it. And that's exactly what we see here in Judges 1. They were in the place of the palms, and that always points to the church. Here we see an oasis in the desert place. And here they are in a type of the church, and they leave the church, they leave the oasis, they leave the place of water and food, and they go to Arad. And that's only significant because the name Arad means dragon. They decide to leave the church, the place of food, the place of shade, the place of shelter, and the place of water to go and dwell with the dragon instead. And that gives you another type, another teaching that points to the history. Judah didn't have a part in this settlement. They were winning victories and fighting against the enemies of the Lord. But whilst they were fighting, here's this group of people who were relaxing, enjoying. Who are they? What would we liken them to? If we were looking for types, what would we liken to them? Are they backslidden Christians? Is that what it's like? Here's these people who've decided that they're just not going to bother. Well, the one thing about the Canaanites is nice and smiley a group of people as they are, always ready to help, you never see them worshipping the Lord. They never worship the Lord anywhere in the Bible. They're never worshipping God. They always seem to be near God, but they're never worshipping God. They never humble themselves and glorify God. So they're there, but they're not really there. So they're not backslidden Christians because they've never been worshipping God. Are they false Christians? Are they wolves in sheep's clothing? Well, no, because they're really nice people. They never do anything that's harmful. They're always just there. Here's an apple. Oh, that's really nice. Everybody wants a Canaanite for a neighbor. They're just nice people. They're the ones that come over and then they've cut your lawn while you were out. Aren't they nice people? So they don't do anything bad. They don't have any bad doctrines. There's nothing wrong with them. In that respect, they aren't wolves in sheep's clothing. They never do anything bad. But they never do anything good either. What we see is, well, the reality is that those people who are in the camp, but they're not of the camp. Well, now, They're not in the camp anymore. They're in the nation. They're the people in the nation, but they're not of the nation. And yet, when the nation is invaded, it'll come to them. And when the Lord blesses the nation, it'll come to them. So they'll be both receivers of God's blessing, and they'll be the recipients of people coming against the people of God, because they just happen to live there. So they're in this bizarrely strange place of, what do you think that crowd is up there? Well, this lot think it's God. Weirdos. They're the group of people who turn up to church every Sunday and they have no idea why. No idea why. They don't know what it's about. They don't know. They can't figure it. They haven't got it in their head. But you go to church on Sunday. I'm here, but I don't even believe in God. You know, that's half the Church of England clergy. But that's the... certainly the higher ups, anyway. They don't know why they're there. Well, it's a job. I don't know why I'm there. I don't know what they are. That's who they are. And here we have, once again, well, it's another charge against Judah, well, actually against all of Israel. That they're so busy taking care of themselves that there's a group of people in their midst that don't even know why they're there. But they've decided that they're going to have one foot in this camp and one foot in that camp. That they're going to be a people of the dragon whilst they live in the church. And that just doesn't make any sense at all. That's who they are. So there's a great one. Any others? So come on, there's lots in this scripture that's got to jump out at you. Go on then.
What's Luz?
What's Luz?
Yeah.
I think it's a place that sells soap. Hey! No, is that Lush? Lux. Oh, right. I thought I got that one. There we go. Right. So, this guy comes out of Luz. And the spies say to him, we'll spare your life if you tell us what's going on in there. So they do. And they spare his life and they let him go. They capture Luz, this place, and later it's called Bethel. Now here's the thing about this story. Bethel was next to Ai. So this takes us somewhere near the earlier history of Joshua, actually. That this was taken at that time. The guy came out, they let him go, and he goes somewhere and sets the whole thing back up again. And I kind of said to you at the start, here's the process of what's going on. Now, the word Luz, it means almond tree. So what do you think almonds represent in the Bible? And it isn't a small guitar folk group. There's only 3 occasions that almonds are in the scripture. One of them, they adorn the menorah, and they're the cups which the lights are adjusted so that they shine onto that. They are in the tabernacle, and they're actually in the holy place as well, the Holy of Holies, because there was something that was made out of an almond tree. Aaron's rod. And Aaron's rod was dead. And then all of a sudden it was budding. Now it isn't uncommon for trees to have their branches cut off and there be enough life in the branch for the branch to start to actually bud, even to start to develop some leaves. It is entirely unheard of for a branch to develop other branches, leaves, and the fruit while still not connected to the tree. It's a line and understanding. Now, it was the evidence that Aaron was the high priest that God had spoken. It sat in the whole place. It sat in the ark as a teach about, well, if the ark is a type of Jesus, he's a type of the resurrection. It's about resurrection. And in a negative sense, That's what we're getting here. Luz is changed to Bethel. So what does Bethel mean? House of God. That's really good. But Luz is resurrected again. Sin keeps coming back. It's not until it's completely eradicated that it won't come back. Now, Luz was now in the land of the Hittites. Modern day we call them Phoenicians. Let's have a look at what Deuteronomy 20 verses 17 to 18 tells us. Deuteronomy 20, 17 to 18.
But you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God has commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. To 18.
Yes. There we go. The Lord tells them to utterly destroy these groups of people, but they don't. So it comes back again. So that's what Luz is. Luz, we see the resurrection, not just the resurrection of the Lord, which is ours. We have the resurrection promise of the new body. There's the understanding of the resurrection that will come also of the enemy. If it is not wiped out, it will constantly return. It keeps coming back. But there's also something interesting about Bethel. Because Bethel, and the taking of Bethel, has a teaching. Bethel means the house of God. And almonds, again, also speak of the Lord actively fulfilling his promises. So everything that they contain it's a thing. So why is it on the menorah? The promise that there'll be a church. Why was there an almond branch that resurrected? Because it was a promise, or the fulfillment of the promise that Aaron would be the high priest. And the Lord made that clear to all the other 12 tribes that all had a hand at becoming high priest to prove that he was. It's a statement that constantly fulfills promises. Now here's something exciting about Bethel. Turn to Genesis 12:8. And 9.
He left from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Then he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Abraham travelled, going on still towards Negev.
So on his journeys, one of his stations, one of the places that he camped, whilst the Lord was getting him to walk the whole land, one of those stations was Bethel. And so if almonds also speak of the promises of God being fulfilled, God was getting Abraham to do that so that he understood where his descendants would live. And right here in Judges 1, Judah went and took that land. A fulfillment of the promises of God. There we go. There's much more that we could get out of this, but time is gone. So unless anybody has any burning questions they want an answer to, we will call time there, otherwise I'll keep you here till 10. But let me encourage you, there's lots more to understand. The 4 of the 5 Philistine villages, the reason for Hormah being in there, they're all things worth looking up in that process. I hope that has blessed you. There is a meaning, there is a deeper meaning. Next week, we're going to read about Joshua dying again. How many? Just several more. Next week we get on to, well, we know why now they made the decisions. Next week we'll find out what the consequences of those decisions would be and why the period of the judges was necessary. The Lord bless you all. Thank you very much.
You